Hi, and welcome to this PnP Virtual Conference session about starting UI testing your solutions. I'm Elio Struyf. I'm working as an engineering lead for Valo Intranet, and I also run a sticker business these days on pyd.shop. If you want, I also write a lot of blog posts on my personal site, which is eliostruyf.com. You can find me on Twitter, and there's also my email address. So if you need me, just ping me and we see what we can do. So why do we need testing? Because this session is all about UI testing, but why do you actually need testing? You need testing because of quality, of course. Every solution needs to be tested in order to make sure if it works and behaves the way how it was defined. But also for cost saving, because we don't like bugs, and if there are bugs, then it's probably something which you didn't take into account in the beginning, and then you have to put some extra effort, extra work in it in order to overcome these bugs. So there are various ways of testing. You have unit testing, you have UI testing, manual testing, monkey testing, all sorts of things. Do you need everything? Yeah. If you have the money, yes, but of course you cannot implement all at once. So if you already have unit tests, a UI test is a great way to start. But why actually UI test? And in my personal preference, I would do and focus on UI testing in the first place, because that validates your solution from A to Z, instead of, if you write a UI test, it might still fail in the UI. Although the function 1 + 1 returns true, it doesn't mean that 2 is going to be rendered inside the UI. And if that's the thing that it needs to do, then your UI test worked, but actually your unit test worked, but your UI isn't working correctly. So here you see another example. So a person is going to close the door. And what's going to happen is that door was closed, but the UI is different. So here it fails. And I know it's a very stupid thing, but this is what's happening in the real life as well. So we write something, we think it's going to be like that, and in the end, the UI is looking very different and it's not fitting together. So unit tests are there for validating if your code is working. And it's also good that if you want to enhance something and you're going to run your unit test and it returns a certain property or a certain value that isn't correct anymore, then you know that your unit test or that your code is failing. But your UI tests are validating if your use case is actually working from A to Z. There are various tools that you can be used, and I'm not going to tell you which tool to use. I would say, hey, test them all out, because all are great, and some of them are maybe even better in your solutions or in your company. The first one that you see here is Selenium. Then you have Puppeteer from Google, Playwright, which is actually coming from Puppeteer. That's a person that moved from Google to Microsoft, and he has rewritten everything, and now he started and he renamed it to Playwright. And then you also have Cypress. Cypress is another tool, this one, which can be used. Very popular library, very actively maintained, and that's also my preference at the moment. But yet again, it's up to you. My demos are going to be around Cypress, but if you like Puppeteer, Playwright, whatever, feel free to use whatever you want. Just know Puppeteer and Playwright are automation frameworks for your browser, so you can run browser automation on it. You still need the testing framework. For that, I would recommend Jest, which is a really good testing framework. And if you're going to test your solutions, there's some good news. And the good news is that Microsoft finally announced that there's an end date for IE 11. So next year, August 17, Microsoft 365 should start supporting IE 11, which is great. Why? Because that's one of the things that depends which tool you're going to pick. Like Selenium can be used to test out IE 11. Still, it's very hard to do, but it can. All these other tools that I showed, they are only focusing on the modern browsers. They can test Firefox, Chrome, Edge, and so on, and WebKit even for Safari. But Selenium can do the same, but with IE11. Selenium has an advantage on which languages can you use, like for instance C#, JavaScript, and so on, where the others are focusing on JavaScript and TypeScript alone. So I like to work in JavaScript or TypeScript because that's bringing me as close as possible to my browser behavior. How do you set things up during your tests in CI/CD? That's also a thing to consider because Selenium is a little bit harder to implement than, for instance, Puppeteer, Playwright, or Cypress. And what are you actually going to test? Is it a public website? Is it SharePoint? Is it Microsoft Teams? All these things, that depends, because some tools work better with iframes, for instance, than others. So for the first demo, I'm just going to give a small demo about getting familiar with Cypress, see what it actually can do, and then we can dive into some other topics. So the first demo that I'm going to do is all about Cypress and what it is and how you can use it. If you never used Cypress before, this is how a default structure looks like. So if you go to Cypress, you find an integration folder. Inside that integration, you can create your tests. I always create PYOD, like a folder name, and then all the folders or the feature that you want to test are then grouped all underneath that one folder. So in here, a very simple test. So this is a new test suite, and every test, or depending on how you want to do it, starts with, before the test starts, I want to do something. Like for instance, if I want to start my test case, I want to go and visit that page. So what you can do is ci.visit and then page URL, which I already defined at the top. So this is going to write or open the site, and then you can start testing it. How can you test it? The same, like one open site, and then you write a new function, and I love arrow functions, and this is all you need to do. So let's not yet write a test case. What we are going to do now is spin up my tester. So it's going to open Cypress, and in a second you see a pop-up, and that should show the Cypress runner. So here you see my two test cases from MS Teams and from PYOD, and you can do some changes in the settings, but here you have something interesting. Here it finds all the browsers that are currently installed on your environment. And of course, in CI/CD, you don't have to select that. You specify that with a command, which one it needs to run. But here you can just specify, oh, I want to test this out in Edge. And now if I'm going to open this test case, it opens another window where it's going to show my test runner. On the left side, it is going to visit this page. And then on the right side, you see an iframe of the actual loaded site. And the cool thing about it is, you can see snapshots of what it's actually doing behind the scenes. Also, you have a playground where you can say, hey, this is what I want to do. So you can select something, you can copy it, and then you can put it here inside your test case, and you can say should, and then, for instance, it should exist. And if you save it and you go again to the site, now it should visit the site, and then it's going to check if this particular image is existing on the page. And that's exactly true. So it finds it at the top, and that's a bit highlighted. Of course, this is not yet rocket science. So what you can also do is you can write a second test, which is going to look for a navigation item where the title is equal to community. It checks if it exists, and then it's going to click it. Then the next one is it's going to check if that community title now is active. And if it's active, then, or for the active community title. And if it's active, that means that we navigated to that particular page. So if we are going to save again, it's going to restart. It's going to this community site, and now this one is active. So community is now active. If I would say, for instance, stickers again, and I should see exist, then it should start failing because stickers is not available. Here you can see that it's going to try a couple of times because it could be that there's some async logic behind the scenes happening, and after it tried for a couple of times, it's going to say, sorry, but I didn't find any element with which is active and where the title is stickers. So this is a really good thing about Cypress, that it has the logic already built into retrying. Now, another great thing is you can do things like this. I'm going to that page, and then I'm going to look for snipcart items count. That's basically our shop system that we are going to use, and I'm going to check if it exists. That's this element that you see at the top, the cart with the 0. And if it exists, I'm going to take this element and I'm going to work with it. And this is like working with jQuery. So you can retrieve that element, and then you can do the jQuery magic like most of us most probably were used to in the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to retrieve it, to retrieve the text value from it, which is 0 at the moment. I'm going to parse it to an int so that it's a number. And then I'm going to look for the first order button. The first order button that should be on this page, this one. If I find the order button, I click on it. And what it will do is asynchronously, that number should be updated. And that's what I'm going to check here. Get me this button again. Still, it should exist. And then check if the internal value or the inner text of that element contains a value +1. And if that is the case, that means that my cart has been updated. And this is how you can do these tests. So if I save this again, go to the community page, it finds myself a button, it clicks on that button, and you see over here, you see a 1. And if we are going to check this test case, so expect that there is an element, and you see that on the top right, then it's going to look for all the buttons, it finds all the buttons, then it's going to find the first one, and it's going to click on the first one. And then at the end, it's going to check, okay, if once clicked, and you see that it's still 0, so it's extremely fast, but it's going to wait until that item has been updated to 1, because there is some async logic. So this was the first demo about Cypress and how it can be used within your site so that you can start testing out your solutions. So this was a demo of Cypress. So this gives you some ideas of how you can use Cypress inside your solutions. Now this was done on a public available website, so everyone can go to it. But what about authentication? So SharePoint, of course, you need to authenticate yourself first before you can actually start testing. So that particular tool that you're going to use cannot just access SharePoint or cannot just access Microsoft Teams. So you first have to do the authentication round before you can actually do that. Now, how does it work? One thing to notice is you need to have a username and password. Why? Because you're an actual user that needs to test the page. You cannot make use of a client ID and a secret in order to check or open a page. So that's a problem. That's why you need to have a username and password. That way you can open a page and then you can start verifying if everything works. And then you have two options. For SharePoint, for instance, you can use a dependency like Node-SP-Auth, which is a node library which does the authentication for you, and then you have an authenticated context that you get back, like the cookies and stuff, and that's what you pass onwards to Cypress. Or another option is to go through the whole login flow. What does that mean? You go to SharePoint, SharePoint redirects you to the login page of Microsoft, and then you're going to start the login with first your username, click on the next button, then your password, click on the next button, and so on and so on. At the end of the flow, you end up on SharePoint as well, and then you can grab all the cookies from SharePoint and do the same thing. So in both of these test cases or in both of these options, you need to have the cookies because you need to have your FedAuth token and so on. Otherwise, you cannot open another page anymore, or you have to go through the full authentication lifecycle again. So let's do a demo about this, only about authentication. The next demo is about authentication. So authentication for SharePoint, for instance, is what you can see here. So in the before, I'm using a custom visit SP method, which is going to do the authentication for me and then starting to visit SharePoint. So Cypress allows you to extend it. So you can add your own commands or plugins very easily, all written in TypeScript or in JavaScript. So here you can see Cypress command add visit SP. So I'm going to retrieve my config. So that's coming from the cypress.json file. And there I'm going to retrieve my username and passwords and the page URL that I pass in from within my test. Then I'm going to run the SharePoint auth, and this is a plugin. So a plugin runs on the Node engine. So what it's going to do is from the moment Cypress starts up and the test is going to run, it will run this SharePoint authentication piece. So it checks if the username and password here are in place, same thing for the page URL, and then it's going to use the Node SP auth library on which I talked about during the slides. It's going to use this for the authentication, and then it's going to return the data. On the data, we will find information like the headers, the cookies, and so on. So that's what is being passed over to the headers of what Cypress is going to use. Now there's one trick. You need to trick your browser from thinking that it's actually running in the parent window instead of an iframe, because Cypress is running everything within an iframe. And if SharePoint thinks that it's running within an iframe, it's only going to render the particular things for that page like you would see in Teams. So there's no Office 365 or Microsoft 365 suite bar at the top. So if I'm going to run this, yet again, it's going to run or start up the test, and it's going to log in, and then you see that it's going to go to the conference. There are some post abort calls, which is basically blocked by my environment, but you see now it's complete, and we are actually on SharePoint. So authentication is something you have to take care of yourself. Now there are a couple of other challenges if you're thinking about end-to-end testing your solutions. First of all is a page lifecycle. We're not working with static sites anymore. There's a lot more dynamic elements on the page, and these dynamic elements are coming from React, Angular, and so on. So that means that what is loaded could be different in a couple of seconds. So the tool should also be aware of that, because the tool should actually wait for an element to become available, or when it navigates, it needs to wait for that. Some tools do it differently, like Cypress is really nice. You just specify get the element and it will wait until that element becomes available with a retry mechanism. Authentication, authorization, we already discussed. How are you going to interact with your browser? That's also different. If you're using Playwright, works with the real browser, where Selenium is going to work with the APIs of the browser. So that's a little bit different. Also, what's the effort to setting up CI/CD? How to run these tests on mobile views? Do you actually need to test it on a mobile? This is for SharePoint. If you want to test it for SharePoint on a mobile device, that's going to work. But what with Teams? Teams cannot be tested on mobile, or not with Cypress, for instance, or Playwright. Then you need to test it with another testing tool, which is specifically created for mobile. How are you going to target elements and iframe interaction? So selectors, that's how you're going to target elements. Parker, what you can see here, so the class Parker is not the same as the class Parker underscore 8f and so on. That's the suffix that SPFX is adding towards it. So the Parker part, that's what you are going to write. But SharePoint Framework is going to create that last suffix to create and to isolate the classes and the styles for that particular component, which is great. But your designers don't know that class. So and the testers neither. So writing your test cases based on this one is going to be harder. So a solution for that is working with data attributes. If you're working with a data attribute, you can just use data dash and then UI test or test UI. Cypress has a couple of default ones, data dash test ID or data dash test. But for instance here, there is data UI test ID being used, and then that is going to stay the same no matter what. And then you make sure that it stays the same. Even SharePoint does it behind the scenes. So I don't know if you ever seen it, but there's a data automation ID. That data automation ID, that's what SharePoint internally uses for automated UI tests. So I won't recommend to use the same one because that could be giving some issues. If you have two site headers, one from you, one from SharePoint, which one do you need to take? So create your own one, but be sure to apply it so that you can use it in your own tests. So next thing is the last demo. What we are going to do is running some tests against SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. For this demo, I prepared a small web art, which is just going to visualize some images. So here you see these two little guys. If I modify the page, then modify the web art, I can say, hey, I want to see only girls, or I want to see all, and then it's going to show me 4 people. And let's do it back on boy. So this is what the web art does. Now behind the scenes, I have my UI test, and my UI test looks as follows. First of all, when I load the page, it's going to check if the page command bar edit button is there. So that's for editing the page. So I created also a little helper class, which is automatically going to integrate that data automation ID from SharePoint. When it exists, it's going to click on it. That puts the page inside edit mode. Then the next thing is we are going to edit the web art. And for editing the web art, you also need to go to that particular zone and then click on the web art. There's force. Sometimes that zone is not available because it's hidden, and Cypress will only click or only interact with items that are visible. So if it's hidden, then you can force it to still click on it so that it becomes visible. And then you're going to find the configure button of the web art and you're going to click on it. So that means that the property pane panel should become visible. And inside the property pane panel, what I then did before is to change my property. And this is what you can do as well over here. So I'm going to specify that my image type is boy. And I'm going to retrieve the input field. I'm going to type in the input boy. And you see type because it's actually typing what your browser is doing. And then you're going to check if the elements have been updated, if there are 2. So you can also, or I can also say, hey, I'm going to do 4 in the next one. And because all should retrieve 4. And then I'm going to save the page. So if we are going to go to Cypress and we are going to run the web art test, what we should see now is that it's going to log in into SharePoint. It's opening the page. It's editing the page. That's what you see over here right now. It's going to look for that element for configuring the web art. It's going to type boy, but boy was already there. And now if I'm going to type all, and it's going to save. And what it found here was it needed to find 4 elements and it found 4 images. So this is what you can do with your solutions in SharePoint. As mentioned, Teams is a special one. Teams is going to work, or in Teams you're going to work with the login.microsoft.com page because there's no dependency for logging in. And if you're going to use a login.microsoft.com page, you cannot actually use it within Cypress because it's using an iframe and the login page is blocking iframes for being used. So that's a way, or that way we need to bypass that, and we do this, or we can do this with the add themes method. The add themes method, if we are going to check there, and that's here, is a method on which we are going to use a themes add, and this method is going to retrieve the cookies and the local storage value, because both are needed for logging in. So this is what it's actually looking like. So behind the scenes, we are going to use Playwright with Chromium, and we are going to log in there. So we are going to log in with a username and password. So we are going to go through the full authentication flow, and at the end of the cycle, we are going to return the cookies and the local storage values. And that's what we retrieve over here in the authentication part. And at the end, we can, when we have the cookies and the local storage, we can set that to Cypress so that Cypress can start using that during your tests. At the top, there was also a special one. Here we override Teams from checking if it's running in an iframe, because yet again, Teams is also going to check if it runs in an iframe. And if it does, it's going to block that. So that's what we are going to do. We are going to override that particular method so that it thinks and it believes that it's running within a normal browser window. So first, when you do the authentication and the authentication is done, we can start visiting the Teams page. You will end up inside Teams, and Teams will have a news message footer, and that's where you can type in your message. And that's what we are going to look for. We are going to click on it, and then we can start writing our things in it. So if I'm ready and I'm going to run this, first of all, there's an authentication flow that's happening behind the scenes, and I specified the headless part to false so that you can actually see this, but normally you won't notice this in Chrome. So here you're logging in, I'm taking all the cookies and I'm setting that to the environment. Now it's going to do this again because my base URL was still set to SharePoint. And that's why, because it needs to mimic the behavior of Teams, is need to update the base URL to Teams, and that's why it's doing it 2 times. If you don't want to see this happening, inside your cypress.json file, there is a base URL at the top, and set the base URL to teams.microsoft.com instead of SharePoint, and then you will notice that that's going to work. So here at the bottom, you see that I'm typing a message, and if everything works fine, then it's going to find the reply and it's going to reply on this message. And this is what has been done. So this is how you can start testing Teams within Cypress, which is really powerful. But it also means that you can also test out your solutions, your chatbots, and so on. So these were some tests inside SharePoint and inside Teams. If you're looking for resources, feel free to go to my blog. I've written a couple of things about Cypress and UI testing. So that was it. I hope that you learned something from it. I hope that you're thinking about going to do some UI testing. So thank you very much for attending my session at the PnP Virtual Conference. Feel free to send us feedback. Always appreciate it, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.